In this video, we'll be looking at how to approach a question on gender in Of Mice and Men. This is a little bit shorter than my other videos because it can be quite repetitive if you've looked at all the other videos and looked at the different male and female characters. Um, so I've tried to condense this, and I do encourage you to look at the other videos that focus on the men and women individually, and that will give you some more ideas of what you could bring to a question about gender. So this is a bit more of a summary. So first of all, let's focus on the female characters. What I would do in this question, if you've got a question about gender in general, is just choose one gender to look at first and then the next, and then inevitably you can't really talk about each gender without talking a little bit about how they interact as well. So I would probably approach by looking at the women first. Of course, you have to talk about Curly's wife. She is the only female character that has dialogue. Um, and so here are some things that I think you should mention. She's clearly objectified. We don't know her name, right? So she is referred to as her husband's property, being Curly's wife. Um, Notice that there's a lot more descriptive detail given to Curly's wife over any other character in terms of her physical appearance. And so that suggests in itself that her physical appearance is much more important than the men's. And therefore, again, linking that to the objectification of women during this time. We'll talk a bit more about context in a moment. Um, she's very kind of sexualized in the way that she is described. You've got that phallic imagery of her curls being described like sausages. Her actions are sexualized when she runs in. Her lips are slightly parted. She breathes strongly. And we don't know if Steinbeck did that on purpose to highlight the objectification of women, or if it's actually his own sexism that's kind of come into his own writing a bit more subconsciously. I like to think the former, but it's all up for interpretation. And of course, to get those higher marks in the exam, you'll want to evaluate, right? And think, well, on one hand, this could have been Steinbeck trying to emphasize the objectification of women. Um, she's also ostracized being a woman. You notice that she never really enters into male space. She stands in the doorway, she looks in, she's not welcome as well. And we can talk about how during this time kind of men's space, the male sphere was really kind of the public world, the working world, whereas the women were expected to stay at home, especially married women. Um, Talking about kind of married women, or at least like domesticated women, the best person or best character to talk about, therefore, is Aunt Clara. She's the maternal figure in this novella. Looking at some references here, she took Lenny as a baby and raised him up. We know we have this image of her wearing a gingham apron, so very domesticated. But I think it's important that she only lives in the memory of George and Lenny. And I think that serves to highlight the distinct lack of maternal love in the real world at this time. And maybe Steinbeck is trying to say something there about how important it is um, that we have that type of love. And we'll look at what effect that has on men in just a moment. And then we have old Susie. We never truly meet old Susie, but we hear about the way, well, we see the way men talk of her. They say that old Susie's a laugh. She's really applauded by the men, right? She's held in high regard. And there's an irony to that, right? Because you think about the way that Curly's wife is so heavily judged by the men. And this is a woman who runs a brothel, essentially. But why, therefore, is she not judged in the same light? And I would argue that's because she can offer the men liquor and girls, and therefore she's useful to them. And she fulfills that kind of patriarchal system in which women serve men. And I think, she's not referred to, we don't know much about her, but she's not referred to as a married woman. And I think there's a comfort in the fact that she holds a very distinct role, which is to serve men with their kind of sexual needs. And that doesn't, I guess, kind of muddy the waters in terms of her being a wife or anything like that. So I think they like women to kind of be put in these very clear, distinct boxes. And Curly's wife challenges that, right? Yes, she is a wife, but she's also lonely. She wants to interact with other men, and they're uncomfortable with that. Okay, so how could you link this to context? So think, of course, you want to mention that in the 1930s, this is a patriarchal society. Therefore, women were subjected, to sexist treatment. And then being really specific there, you might want to talk about the glamorous Hollywood female stars at the time. They would have been celebrated for their beauty, and you could argue that that reflected the societal attitudes at the time, that women's worth was really derived from their physical appearance. And of course, that could explain why Curly's wife makes such an effort with her own appearance. She clearly makes an effort and dresses up for the ranch. Now, you can argue all she's doing is mirroring what she's seeing on screen and what's encouraged in kind of popular society. But the men see it as her trying to lure them, right? She's that kind of femme fatale character. She's dangerous to men, right? And so they see it in a more sinister way. I've already mentioned this portrayal of old Susie and Aunt Clara really highlight the expectations of women. On one hand, they should fulfill men's domestic needs, but they should also fulfill their sexual needs. And there might be a conversation there about kind of the hypocrisy of that. Like, they can't be, one person can't be that. They seem to like to kind of put women in boxes. Women were kind of perceived as inferior. That's why they were paid half of what men were paid for the same job. And that could explain why Curly's wife is definitely treated as someone who's inferior to the other men. Because of high unemployment, it was really frowned upon for married women to work, because it was seen as them taking the job of men who needed it to support their family. So they were encouraged to stay at home and be domesticated. And again, that could explain why Curly's wife is not welcome in the workspace of the men, right? Because women should be at home, and that kind of reflects the way that it was seen in wider society during this time. Wives were viewed as the responsibility, if not the property, of their husband. Again, you can link this to Curly's wife, her title, we don't know her name. But this is important because the wife's actions reflected on their husband. So if a wife commits adultery, it would be the husband that would look bad, right? He would be considered weak because he can't control his wife. And so you might argue that's why Curly has such paranoia around his wife. When she's missing, he can't find her. He thinks she's with Slim, because he knows it's going to reflect badly on him. And so that kind of enforces this desire to control your wife, because otherwise you're going to be viewed in a different light publicly. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. So moving on to the male characters, I try to, rather than organize it by character, think about different ways masculinity is presented. We do see a side of masculinity that's very powerful, and I would encourage you to focus on the boss in this instance, who is the most powerful in the novella. And the way to support this is to think about those string of questions he uses when he first meets George and Lenny. He's like interrogating them, right, to find out, all about them, what they're up to. So that clearly indicates his power. And then by the end, he says to George, "I got my eye on you." So he really speaks to him in a threatening tone. And that's really used to instill fear in all his workers. And we can see that works when we see the way Candy shuffles past him. There are plenty more examples of the boss and how he misuses his power, especially with crooks as well. So that's something that you could look at. They are cruel, and I think the best character to use as an example here is Carlson. The best quote, I think, is, why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the pups to raise up. He's so dismissive about killing a dog who is so important to Candy. It's his companion, and he's just like, why don't we just shoot him and replace him? But he's an important character because he really represents the cruel world in which they live. You could link that to capitalism, this kind of dog eat dog world, excuse the pun. Um, but yeah, he really represents this new world where you're only worth something if you're useful to someone, and as soon as you're not, you're dismissed. And we can certainly see how that's the case for Candy. He definitely feels that sense that he's getting old, he's disabled, soon he's going to be thrown out to the streets, and then there'll be no one to help him. There's no elderly relief for him to rely on, and he doesn't have any family. Um, Look at Curly as a great example for men being violent. Okay, he's always ready for a fight. Watch how his hands close into fists. He's in a slight crouch, so he kind of takes the stance of a boxer, ready to attack at any time. He picks fights, right? Starts a fight on Lenny. Obviously, that doesn't work out well for him. And if you want to go further with that, I would talk about kind of how that's really his insecurity playing, right? He wants to prove that he is the most powerful. And we'll come to that now about men being insecure. Think about how Boss and Curly wear high-heeled boots as a symbol of their power, but really maybe an indication of their insecurity and their anxiousness to really prove, look, I'm the most powerful here. Look at my high-heeled boots. And then we see that again, we see that insecurity in Curly when he's got these unfounded suspicions of Curly's wife and Slim when he can't find his wife. And that shows kind of a lack of confidence in his own ability to please his wife. And you might say the loneliness of the ranch workers is a result of their insecurities. They're in this cruel world. Again, we'll link this to capitalism in a minute when we look at context. And that's created a distrust between men because it's really pitted everyone against each other rather than being a uniting force. There's a lot of misogyny on the ranch. Why don't you tell her to stay the hell at home where she belongs, is what Carlson says to Curly. So this idea again that women were not welcome in the same domain as men. He views Curly as weak because he's unable to control her. And then when Curly's wife dies, Candy says, "You done it, didn't you? This poor woman's just been murdered." And he's got no sympathy for her whatsoever. In fact, he blames her for her own murder. And that could reflect the normalisation of violence against women and this perception of them being second class to men. But they are capable of compassion. I've just done a real long list of all these negative traits of masculinity. But I think Steinbeck was trying to emphasise something, that deep down we're all capable of compassion. We can all be good. Look at, and the best people I think to look at would be George and Lenny's friendship, but also Slim as well. So looking at George and Lenny, I got you to look after me, you got me to look after you. That is the kind of ideal that Steinbeck wants to put out there. We can be friends, we can watch each other's backs, we can be kind to each other, we can be compassionate. So we see that in George and Lenny. And then at the end of the novella, we also see that when Slim comforts George, "Come on, George, me and you will get a drink," okay? And so I think even though there's a lot of negativity in this novella and men aren't necessarily portrayed in the best light, I think Steinbeck isn't saying that to be negative necessarily about men, but to emphasize, look what this environment has done of capitalism. Look what it has produced in us. Look what it's kind of drawn out of us. But deep down, you know, we can be these wonderful, kind human beings. So how do we link this to context? Think about the environment, because I think Steinbeck was really trying to emphasize, look how this environment has brought the worst out in us. So the high demand for work amongst migrant workers because of the high unemployment, created a competitive and hostile environment. So rather than these hardships being a uniting factor, it actually set them against each other in the name of self-interest. Don't forget also, this is a real transient lifestyle for these workers, right? Because they have to move from ranch to ranch wherever there's a job. So it means it's impossible for them to settle down, impossible for them to establish, definitely, there's no chance to establish a family, not even to be able to establish really long lasting friendships. So they're very lonely, and I think that's brought the worst out in them. It's a patriarchal society, as we talked about. Women are considered weaker. That could explain the way Curly's wife is poorly treated. Um, for Steinbeck, Slim represents this idealized American cowboy. He's of high moral standing. He contrasts with the greed of the capitalists that he believes were destroying agricultural life. And I think more than that, destroying like humanity. Again, he really believed that like capitalism brought the worst out of human beings. And so Slim is really there to represent this old order, this old way of life that he would love to kind of go back to. Don't forget, also on top of this, we have this ideology that's feeding into capitalism, and not only capitalism, but political life, medical life, and this idea of, you know, basically the strongest wins, and you've just got, and that's just nature. And unfortunately, the weakest, they'll just kind of die out. All right, to put it really bluntly. So that meant that, you know, there's no belief left, no compassion for the likes of Lenny, Candy, those who struggle, because it would have been seen as kind of the natural order. And it really helped excuse cruelty, okay, because that's just life, that's just nature. Curly's violence could symbolise the brutal world created by capitalism as well. So bringing it back to capitalism, this of course being seen by Steinbeck. This highly competitive world creates a need for power and to defend and maintain it. So that's everything. I know this has been kind of a bit of a different video in the way that it's been structured, but that's my advice. And please look at the individual characters to kind of look at that kind of masculinity and femininity in greater detail as well. As always, I love to read your comments. I don't always get a chance to reply, but I think it's so useful for other viewers as well to have a look at the alternative comments. To get those higher marks, you want to be evaluative, right? You want to be exploring different interpretations and not just having this set view of these characters, and really thinking about the bigger picture of what you think Steinbeck was trying to say through these characters and through their dialogue and actions. Okay, yeah, I'll leave it there. Please leave a comment.